Hello, and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, a podcast for people who care about environmental sustainability and climate action. I'm your host, and today's guest provides consulting services to government agencies and startup companies in the energy industry. She has 15 years experience in oil and gas, project development and delivery in Trinidad and Tobago. She began her career at local conglomerate Neil & Massey, now Massey, developing strategic development plans and feasibility studies for new energy business. She has worked in project engineering at Worley Parsons with clients including British Gas, now Shell, BHP Billiton, Chevron, and the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago. She holds a BSc in Chemical and Process Engineering, an MSc in Oil and Gas Exploration and Production, and is currently pursuing an MBA in Sustainable Energy Management. Her broad experiences provides her with a comprehensive understanding of energy markets and a unique viewpoint on value creation in energy projects. I am delighted to welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, Miss Nneka Matthews. Hi, Nneka.
Hi, Deval. It's so good to be here.
It's so good to have you joining me on the podcast and for us to discuss the transformation of the global energy sector.
Yep, this is certainly an exciting time. The future holds tremendous possibilities in the area of sustainability as well as specifically in the energy sector.
Certainly. Energy is a key issue globally, particularly in our region, depending on which side of the fence you sit, either as a producer or an importer. Energy has a significant influence on our economies and our sustainable development. And for a long time, the energy sector has been dominated by fossil fuels. For our region, that would be oil and gas.
Yeah.
And the oil and gas industry, it's characterized as being very volatile with cycles of boom and bust as the prices fluctuate. So in addition, the influence of energy on our environment has gained prominence as we grapple with climate change and as we seek to minimize global temperature increase. Essentially, in 2020, we are dealing with multiple crises all at once. We have the health crisis with the global pandemic, the economic crisis as world economies are shrinking, and on top of that, we have the ongoing climate crisis. So, Nneka, as someone who has spent the past 15 years in the energy sector, what is your take on the impact of this disruption on the energy sector?
Well, there's certain fundamentals about energy that we know, but we forget. Energy is basically a unit of economic input. No matter how you try to change the formula, you can't really have an economy of any kind, digital or otherwise, without the use of energy. And so anything that happens in the energy sector, regardless of what kind of energy we're talking about, the traditional system that was based on fossil fuels or new systems based on alternative types of energy, the equation of what energy does in the economy remains the same. And so if you have a crisis that affects any type of economic activity, it's going to affect energy. And if you have a crisis in the energy sector, it's going to affect the economy. And so there's a delicate balance that has to be held, regardless of what choices we make about what type of energy we want to use in the future and what we want to be able to use it to do. One of the things that kind of stays in my mind right now with all the activity towards a sustainable energy transition is that we don't have a killer app in energy. And by that I mean It's something that can give you so much more functionality than whatever existed before. So, for example, when you have a smartphone now, you can do so many things on it than you could have done with your old Nokia TDME 1100. I'm sure everybody remembers that, right? Because it may have been the first phone that you had.
The one
It
with
was
the antenna,
indestructible.
right?
The one with the antenna, right? And it was indestructible, right? It could fall out of your pocket, fall apart, and you put it back together again, and it worked fine. And you could hear really good. The keypad was big enough. You could send a text, right? But that's basically all that it could do. And if you compare that to the smartphone that you have now, because everybody has one, regardless of whether it's, Apple or Android, you have a platform now that lets you do so many things that were not possible 15 years ago. You can send an email. You can call. You can do a lot of the computing things that you couldn't have done in the past on a cellular phone. You can take pictures. You can make videos. You can call somebody and see them. There's so much that you can do with a phone. It's more, we still call it a phone, but it's so much more than a phone. Like, the phone part is probably the least used part of your actual smartphone that you carry around with you. Now, in energy, as a unit of economic inputs, you don't really have something as yet that does everything that fossil fuels do. Because sometimes we think of fossil fuels as energy, so we only think about, being able to use it directly for energy. But we also use it to make petrochemicals. Some applications you have to use it directly as combustion. Other times you use the products to be able to make other things. And then in addition to that, any type of construction activity requires huge amounts of energy to make that happen. For example, if you require steel, if you require cement, etc., you have to have a particular type of energy that's able to do those things. So that when you start to talk about making an energy transition and basically reducing demand, because that's the only way you can really do it, what you're saying is you'll have a reduced level of economic activity. That's just the way the equation works. And so unless you have a new form of energy that can do all the things that fossil fuels are able to do, you're going to have a huge gap in being able to meet your transition requirements. And it's something that I think is difficult to talk about, because right now it's like this blank space that we have to figure out. And I believe that we need much more research going into the technology, much more research going into new opportunities for us to be able to do things differently. And that's an area where I'm not so sure where the funding is coming from for specifically that. There's funding for technologies that exist already, but as yet that killer app that gives you so much more functionality out of any type of energy to be able to do everything that you're used to doing is not there yet. And in terms of the disruption hitting the energy sector, I think that's something that we're kind of overlooking a bit. And I think it's something that is very important to pick up on and shift the thinking around it, because I think that's the gap that we're missing when we think about how to participate in a transition. There's so much for the transition to work. There is so much that has to change. And I think we spend a lot of our energy worrying about what's going to be lost and maybe not seeing the opportunity for new developments that create new industries, new sectors, new activities, and therefore new opportunities for everybody to have more economic wealth. And that's an important part of the energy transition. It's not just what we're going to lose. Sometimes, like, I don't ever think about my TDMA phone. Except that, wow, I enjoyed it so much, even though it was so simple. But there is no way I would trade back with my smartphone now for what I had. And that's something I think we really need to take hold of.
So you highlighted several of the many applications of fossil fuels. And on episode 5 of this podcast, featuring Dr. Devon Gardner of the CARICOM Energy Unit, we spoke about the dark side of fossil fuels. And the sad reality is that the burning of fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, produces greenhouse gases. carbon, methane, nitrous oxides, which are increasing global temperatures and leading to a host of other negative effects. And the energy transition is about transforming our energy systems away from fossil fuels to more environmentally friendly alternatives. And these alternatives include renewables as well as the efficient use of energy. So we're seeing a greater emphasis being placed on alternatives. But from what you just described, fossil fuels will continue to be relevant, until we find that sweet spot. But the trend is that the focus is now on decarbonizing our energy systems. And in the past, there seemed to have been some resistance to this shift. Why do you think this shift is occurring now?
Yeah. I think this is really a innovation issue. So in the area of innovation, there's the dilemma that anybody who is faced with change has to deal with. And that is when do you jump on board? When do you ride the wave of change? And so there will always be early adopters, people that recognize that change is coming. They are aware of, maybe new technologies and they can see the possibilities for them, and they jump on board and they harness that and they move with it quickly. And those first movers will always have a really good advantage as markets change. And then there'll be others who adopt the technology or whatever the change is a little bit later. And then there are those that will wait until it's ubiquitous, until there is not really a reason or even an opportunity to stick with what you used to use. And only then will they adapt. I think with regard to oil and gas, because of COVID-19, as well as because of the general moves in recent years to take climate change seriously, and the moves of governments around the world to increase policy around cleaner energy, it's affected the outlook for demand for oil and gas. Now, in the oil and gas sector, we know it's a high revenue earning sector, but that's not really because of the price of oil itself. The price of oil has basically always hovered around $40 a barrel. What makes the energy sector so lucrative, the fossil fuel sector, is the potential for windfall profits when the price is very high. So that the business model for oil and gas is really about that potential for upswing. And it's really based on an environment in which demand outstrips supply. Because as long as you have that, you will have the potential for prices to be very high. And that potential is what is exciting for shareholders. That's what they invest in. The potential that you could go from $40 a barrel to $120 a barrel and just make massive amounts of money. It's also one of the reasons that the oil and gas sector has been attacked in the past, because it's a lot of profit to make very quickly, but it does impact the environment in a negative way, especially because scenarios like that not only affect the environment, but they affect society, because a situation where you have a price that can just go up very, very high has economic knock-on effects, because a high price of energy is great for an energy producer. But what happens is, if you sustain those high prices, consumers cannot afford energy. It means that if you are a working person and you're just trying to live your life, now more of your finances have to go towards just being able to provide the basic things that energy provide, which is everything. It's your food, your shelter, your clothing, your security, the lights in your house, warmth, everything. So that there's a wider effect both on society and the environment when energy prices are high. And the whole world has had this problem. Well, when I say the whole world, all of us have had this problem. The thing is, in developed countries, they've had the opportunity to inspect the problem and see what was really going on. And they've made certain moves to change that. And with those moves, the policy adjustments, as well as the latest development, which is facing this pandemic situation that has drastically affected demand for fossil fuels, we're seeing an outlook, and BP recently published their outlook for energy. And we're seeing an outlook where that potential for that upswing in demand is no longer there. And without that, a company that is entrenched in oil and gas has to ask itself, how much should it be investing in developing future reserves? How much should it be investing now in trying to increase its operating margin? Where are the best places to invest? And as their strategy changes to adjust to that, we're finding that they have to try to decarbonize. To me, energy companies know perfectly well that the oil and gas industry will remain for the very reason that there is no killer app, right? Unless the technology is invested in for something to provide more functionality than oil and gas provides, you're not going to see it. So it's not going to happen for a while, right? You can bring on alternative energy and they can do what they can do. But in the interim, there's certain things like just construction for one. Construction is probably the biggest one, because if you are saying that you're going to try to reduce fossil fuels, okay, you could address like major transport, because there's stuff with hydrogen fuel cells for marine transport and for large trucking systems and that. So you can kind of deal with the logistics system, right? You can kind of deal with consumer individual transport, because you can kind of make it unattractive for people to really buy new cars, and those that do maybe on the higher end, so they buy electric vehicles, right? Or you can make it mandatory or whatever, right? But for all the other industrial things, you can start bringing on, green hydrogen to make ammonia, this, that, and the other. But you know what? All of that is dependent on how much people consume. And people can only consume if they have money. And people can only have money if they have jobs. And people can only have jobs if there's demand. And there can only be demand if you use energy. So that unless we have like a new way to create economic wealth without using energy the way we have, you kind of have a cycle that just kind of supports itself.
So, Nneka, you're talking about delinking our economies from energy.
No, so this is the thing, right? I've heard this thing many times. It sounds like nonsense to me. I don't understand how you could delink the economy from energy, because energy is a basic economic unit of economic input. So countries make reports that they're finding that their GDP is not as closely linked to energy consumption as in the past, right? But the reality is there is nothing that you use that didn't take energy to produce it, regardless of whether it was a physical, tangible good or an intangible service.
Yes.
You may not have used the energy in your country, but somewhere on planet Earth, the energy was used. And that's where it gets accounted.
But I think the argument is that you are able to extract more from that one molecule of energy as opposed to what it would have produced in the past. It's a matter of increased efficiency.
You can increase efficiency within the limits of what physics will allow. But what ends up actually happening is that if you want to make money, you have to sell product, no matter how efficient that product is. Yes, if it's efficient, you can get more use out of the same energy that you put into it. But let's go back. It's the same energy. So that if you're talking about cutting fossil fuel use, right, it means that you are still talking about using the same energy to get greater economic outputs. So that where is the cut going to happen?
I will revise my statement and say delinking our economies from fossil fuels, because I agree with you, you will always need energy to power your economy. Yeah. But the issue here is the source of that energy and the impact that energy has. I mean, you have spent 15 years and I have spent a decade working in the energy sector. And I must agree, it's very dynamic. I would say it's an exciting field to be a part of.
Yep, for sure.
And you also mentioned how lucrative the oil and gas business model is, or has been, with the potential for upswings, with the price moving from $40 a barrel to 120.
Yeah.
So that covers the economics. But there are other aspects or externalities that are not factored in,
Yeah,
or
that's
that
true.
that weren't factored in the past, but now you're seeing a more pressure. Yeah, I would say greater pressure
It
to,
is greater pressure,
to
certainly.
account for the environmental and social impact of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
fossil fuel industry.
yeah. I think a part of it as well is that, the social contract has sort of changed. And it's something that we see more. It's so funny. We actually see every impact of the sustainability issue in every economy around the world, in every sector of society. The thing is, we don't necessarily know how to recognize it. So in developed countries, young people, millennials, have recognized that the social contract has changed. They would have seen, as we would have seen, parents have jobs, have a certain amount of job security, work for a long time, and do things. They buy a house, they buy a car, they send their kids to school, etc., etc. And the outlook for that, for the generation that's coming up, has changed. There's no such thing as job security anymore. In many
Certainly.
countries, the idea of, like my parents, I mean, they knew there was a home available in every income category that you were in, right? For our generation, it's not like that. And in many countries, home ownership is no longer a goal, because what's the point? How are you gonna support that? How are you gonna pay for that in the long term without job security? Owning a car is not that big a deal anymore. So a lot of things have changed. And knowing that young people now, knowing that they have to rely on themselves a lot more, I think are scrutinizing companies certainly a lot more. And that's where the sustainability issue, I think, has really started to come up, especially because of the presence of social media that now allows young people to not only research a company very quickly. It doesn't have to be in-depth research. You go on Facebook, somebody mentioned something, you can go and check it yourself. You see how the company is, and you say what you feel about it. And depending on how clever you are and how you put that forward, that can circulate around the whole world to your whole demographic of associates, and it suddenly becomes very big, and it now affects the reputation and the image of the company. And so companies have an issue, regardless of whether they're in the energy sector or some other sector, where their work, what they do, is under the very real threat of no longer being attractive to young people who are entering the workforce. The consumer age of your life is from about 25 to 45. So if that generation of people is not interested, where is the demand going to be? If that generation of people is not empowered in terms of they don't have the money to spend. So this is two different issues. One is whether you're interested, and one is whether you can even afford it. Because do you have a job? Did you hustle to make it on your own? You had an online business or whatever it is that you did, and you made it yourself. You're not going to be in a hurry to buy from a big institutionalized corporation. You're going to buy from somebody who's like you. So it changes the whole arrangement. You also have a situation in which, if you notice, even before COVID, even before we were talking about climate change in a big way, the biggest companies in the world, the most asset-heavy companies in asset-heavy industries like energy for one, industrials for another, telecommunications, utilities, for example, all these companies were seeing a decline in their operating margins because something was happening. And the something that's been happening is that as we get closer to basically wearing out the limits of the resources of this planet that can support us here, everything becomes harder to do. The business becomes harder to do. The competition becomes stiffer. And all of that impacts that breaking of the social contract in terms of the job stability not being there, in terms of the outlook for people's incomes not necessarily matching their expectations based on what they've spent on our education. And all of these issues link together under the sustainability umbrella. And they hit not just the energy sector. We see it in the energy sector because of the significance, the link between energy and economics. You don't have an economy without energy input. And the energy sector, based on fossil fuels, because of those upswings in price, has that potential for that huge windfall profit that is very visible, or at least it has been. Now the tech companies are kind of replacing that. And that shift, that overall shift that anybody who is heading up a company can see happening, is very compelling. It's almost impossible not to decarbonize in the face of that, or at least try to. Because if you don't, you'll be left behind in a world that increasingly requires more sustainability if the economic model is to continue. And even that I have a bit of trouble saying, because I don't think the economic model that we're used to can continue. I think we've probably exhausted it. I think we are probably at a time where we really need to ask ourselves, well, what kind of world do we want to live in? And this is no longer a question for philosophers and tree huggers. It is a real business question that the answer to that is going to affect what direction the whole world goes. Because if we are at the limits of what the planet could realistically support based on the models that we have, then unless something is going to change, we headed towards disaster. There was a study in the 70s called Limits to Growth. And what it did was it modeled a lot of things, population, the different resources of the world, etc., and modeled it, projected it out all the way to 2100. And those models suggested that we would have a collapse before 2100 based on the path that we were on. And so far, most of the things were spot on. So that unless something shifts, we're kind of headed in a pretty bad way. There was another book by Jared Diamond, Collapse. And that book was basically about societies making choices that, in a lot of instances, ended their civilizations. And it was about resources. Most of the time, the issue was resources, that the resources that they used to build up these fantastic civilizations they had, the key resource started to run out. They kind of ran up against the limits of that resource. And they weren't able to make any kind of change. And then all the things happened that we've been seeing now, the economics collapse. You start to see the prevalence of all kinds of unusual diseases. And then eventually you got civil unrest and people turn on each other, and that was the end of that. Now we look at this in science fiction movies and, we kind of laugh it off. At least we used to until it started to happen, right? When we weren't aware of it, it was fiction, it was fantasy. But now that we see it, especially having social media and being so connected and being able to see everything, we see it happening and it's not funny anymore. We don't want to see those kinds of movies right now because it's dystopian. Dystopian is not interesting to look at anymore because it hits a little bit too close to home.